Camilla brought 20 Parker Bowleses to the coronation. There were 4 Middletons. And in that moment, it was absolutely noticeable to those people who'd been excluded from the coronation that nobody, let alone Kate, curtsied to Queen Camilla.
Something extraordinary is said to have happened behind palace walls, not with a public announcement, not with a dramatic press conference, but through a quiet review of files that may have revealed far more than Prince William, the Prince of Wales, expected to find. According to claims that have circulated among royal commentators, what began as a routine examination of royal operations soon evolved into a discovery that raised uncomfortable questions about influence, loyalty, and the future direction of the monarchy. By the time these reports began attracting attention, the atmosphere surrounding the royal family was already changing. King Charles III remained on the throne, but conversations about succession were becoming increasingly impossible to avoid. The public focus on Catherine, Princess of Wales, Prince George, and the next generation of royals continued growing, while palace insiders reportedly spoke more openly about how Prince William was preparing for the responsibilities that would eventually come with becoming king. Yet few people imagined that one of the earliest signs of that preparation might emerge from something as seemingly ordinary as an internal review. According to various reports and online claims, the Prince of Wales decided to take a closer look at parts of the royal institution that had operated largely unchanged for years. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Financial records were present. Administrative structures appeared functional. Official appointments seemed routine. But as William reportedly examined the details more closely, certain names allegedly began appearing again and again, attached to advisory roles, charitable projects, and positions of influence that stretched across multiple areas of royal life. What would you think if the same circle of individuals repeatedly appeared in places where influence mattered most? Would you dismiss it as coincidence, or would you begin asking deeper questions about how those connections developed in the first place? That question appears to sit at the center of this entire story. Reports suggest that Prince William became increasingly interested in understanding how particular networks of relationships had evolved over time, especially those connected to Queen Camilla and individuals who had reportedly been close to her for decades. None of this automatically indicated wrongdoing, and no public evidence has emerged proving improper conduct. However, according to commentators discussing these claims, William's curiosity reportedly intensified as more patterns allegedly emerged from the records under review. The significance of that possibility becomes clearer when viewed against the backdrop of Queen Camilla's remarkable rise within the royal family. Few figures in modern royal history have experienced a transformation as dramatic as Queen Camilla's journey from one of the most controversial personalities in Britain to a crowned queen standing beside King Charles III. That transformation required extraordinary resilience, careful imagery building, and years of navigating public scrutiny. Some observers believe that surviving such a difficult path naturally encouraged Queen Camilla to build strong networks of trusted allies around her. Yet that interpretation introduces another fascinating question. If trusted relationships helped Queen Camilla survive one of the most turbulent chapters in modern royal history, could those same relationships later become a source of concern for a future king determined to reshape the monarchy? According to reports, Prince William allegedly began examining not just individual appointments but broader patterns. Certain advisors, consultants, and longtime associates reportedly appeared connected to projects across different areas of royal activity. Again, these claims remain unverified and should not be treated as established fact, but the narrative emerging from these reports suggests that William became increasingly interested in understanding whether those connections reflected ordinary institutional continuity or something more significant. As the future king reportedly dug deeper, another figure is said to have entered the conversation: Princess and the Princess Royal. Unlike many members of the royal family, Princess, and has earned a reputation for directness, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to duty. Because of that reputation, any suggestion that Princess and took an interest in these questions immediately attracted attention among royal watchers. According to the claims surrounding the story, William allegedly shared some of his concerns with the Princess Royal. Whether those conversations happened exactly as described remains impossible to verify publicly. However, The idea itself resonated with many observers because Princess and Prince William are often viewed as two of the monarchy's most institution-focused figures. Both are frequently associated with discipline, practicality, and a willingness to prioritize long-term stability over short-term convenience. And this is where the story begins moving beyond questions about individuals and toward questions about the institution itself. Because if Prince William was genuinely reviewing long-standing systems and relationships, the implications would extend far beyond Queen Camilla's circle. The review would effectively become a question about how power operates inside the monarchy, how influence develops over decades, and how future leadership might decide to preserve or reform those structures. Would a future king choose continuity, preserving arrangements established under previous reigns? Or would a future king attempt to redesign the institution according to a new vision centered around transparency, efficiency, and a smaller core of trusted figures? According to many royal commentators, that question may ultimately matter more than any specific allegation or rumor. The monarchy is entering a period of transition unlike any it has experienced in decades. King Charles III represents the present. Prince William represents the future. Catherine, Princess of Wales, represents continuity and public confidence. Every decision now exists within that larger context. As reports continued circulating, the story became even more intriguing because attention shifted away from what Prince William may have found and toward what those discoveries could potentially reveal about his leadership style. Some observers began suggesting that the Prince of Wales was demonstrating an increasingly proactive approach to royal governance. Others argued that the reports reflected little more than speculation fueled by public fascination with succession and palace dynamics. But regardless of which interpretation proves closest to reality, one thing became increasingly clear. The discussion was no longer simply about Queen Camilla or a handful of advisors. The discussion had become a debate about the future shape of the monarchy itself. And according to the most intriguing versions of these reports, the discoveries Prince William allegedly made during those early reviews were only the beginning. Because the deeper the future king reportedly looked, the more questions emerged, and the answers he was set to uncover would eventually lead toward a confrontation that few inside the royal family could have anticipated. What happened next would transform a quiet review into something far more consequential, and according to those following the story closely, the most explosive revelations had not yet surfaced. What transformed these reports from an interesting royal story into something potentially far more significant was not the suggestion that Prince William had questions. Future kings are expected to ask questions. What captured attention was the implication that those questions may have led toward an examination of how influence itself operates within the monarchy. And once that possibility entered the discussion, the story became much larger than any individual name appearing in a file. According to royal commentators who have followed these claims, the alleged review gradually shifted from examining appointments and relationships to examining patterns. A single appointment can be explained. A single recommendation can be justified. A single professional connection may mean very little. Yet some observers argue that when similar connections appear repeatedly across different areas of an institution, attention naturally turns toward the structure rather than the individuals. That distinction matters because institutions rarely change through one dramatic event. More often, institutions evolve through hundreds of smaller decisions made over many years. Some analysts believe that this is precisely what reportedly interested the Prince of Wales. The question was no longer whether certain people held influence. The question became how influence had been accumulated, preserved, and expanded over time. And if that was the real question, the implications reached far beyond the present moment. Because every monarchy depends upon networks. Advisors advise. Staff members build careers. Trusted relationships form across decades. The British royal family is no exception. The challenge comes when a future generation inherits structures that were built by a previous one. At that point, continuity and reform begin competing with one another. Would Prince William preserve existing arrangements because they had become part of the institution, or would the future king view those arrangements as belonging to a different era? That uncertainty appears to have fueled much of the speculation surrounding these reports. Some royal watchers noted that William has often been associated with a more streamlined vision of monarchy. Over the years, commentators have repeatedly suggested that the heir to the throne favors a smaller and more focused royal operation, one centered around clearly defined responsibilities rather than expansive networks of personal relationships. Whether that characterization is entirely accurate remains open to debate, but it helps explain why these claims attracted so much attention. Because if a future king truly believes the monarchy must become leaner, then every inherited structure eventually comes under scrutiny. What makes the story even more intriguing is that several observers have argued the timing may be just as important as the substance. King Charles III remains monarch, yet discussions about the future have become increasingly visible. Public attention continues shifting toward Catherine, Princess of Wales, and the next generation. The Wales family increasingly represents what many people imagine when they think about the monarchy's future. That creates a fascinating dynamic. Every institution preparing for a transition faces a delicate balancing act. Existing leadership must govern the present while future leadership quietly prepares for tomorrow. Most of the time that process remains invisible. According to some analysts, however, the reports surrounding William's alleged review suggest that the preparation phase may already be influencing how certain decisions are viewed inside royal circles. If that interpretation is correct, then another question immediately emerges. How do individuals connected to previous centers of influence respond when they sense change approaching? That question sits beneath many of the claims associated with this story. Reports suggest that some of the people allegedly linked to Queen Camilla's circle had occupied respected positions for years. In many cases, these relationships reportedly predated Charles's accession to the throne. From one perspective, that continuity could be seen as loyalty and experience. From another perspective, it could be viewed as a system increasingly tied to personalities rather than institutional priorities. Neither interpretation can be proven simply by looking at the reports themselves. Yet the existence of competing interpretations is precisely what makes the story significant. This is no longer a debate about facts alone. It has become a debate about meaning. What do long-standing networks represent? Stability or entrenchment? Continuity or resistance to change? Depending on the observer, the answer may be completely different. And then there is Princess Anne. The reported involvement of the Princess Royal introduced an entirely new layer of significance because Anne is not typically associated with palace intrigue. Royal commentators often describe her as one of the monarchy's most disciplined and institution-focused figures. If reports suggesting private discussions between Anne and William contain any truth, some observers believe that fact alone would indicate concerns extending beyond routine administrative questions. Why? Because Princess Anne has spent decades watching different generations navigate the pressures of royal life. The king's sister understands how influence moves within the institution and how public appearances can differ from private realities. That experience gives weight to any suggestion that Anne may have shared concerns about long-term governance. Still, the most intriguing aspect of the story may not be what was allegedly discovered. It may be what those discoveries supposedly revealed about the future king himself. According to several analysts, the reports portray William as increasingly willing to challenge assumptions that previous generations may have accepted without question. Whether discussing public roles, institutional priorities, or internal structures, the future monarch is often described as someone who believes the monarchy must continually justify its place in modern society. If that perception is accurate, then the alleged review may have represented something larger than an investigation. It may have represented a test of how much inherited influence should remain untouched. A test of whether tradition alone is sufficient justification for preserving existing arrangements. A test of how a future king intends to balance respect for the past with preparation for the future. And that is where the story takes its most interesting turn. Because according to the most persistent versions of these claims, the deeper William reportedly looked, the more resistance allegedly began appearing. Not open resistance, not public confrontation, but something far more difficult to define. Missing clarity, contradictory explanations, questions that seemed harder to answer than expected. Were those simply the normal complications that accompany any large institution, or were they signs that the future king had stumbled into something much more sensitive? Nobody outside the royal family can answer that question with certainty. What remains clear is that the story was no longer about reviewing records. The The story had become about competing visions for the monarchy's future. And according to those following the claims most closely, the next phase would move beyond questions of influence and into something far more consequential: whether the people surrounding the institution were prepared for the changes Prince William may already have been considering. The possibility that Prince William's review was revealing more than administrative irregularities helps explain why this story continued growing in significance. By this stage, the discussion was no longer centered on who occupied specific positions or who knew whom. Instead, attention increasingly focused on what those relationships might reveal about competing visions for the monarchy itself. And according to several royal commentators, that distinction may be the key to understanding why these reports attracted such intense interest. One reason is that institutions often reveal their priorities not through public speeches but through the people who occupy influential spaces behind the scenes. Some observers have suggested that William's alleged review may have been less about identifying problems and more about understanding how decisions were actually shaped within the royal ecosystem. If that interpretation is correct, then the future king was not simply looking at personnel structures. The future king was reportedly trying to understand where influence originated and how it moved. That possibility creates an interesting connection to a broader challenge facing modern monarchies. Every generation inherits structures created by previous generations. Some of those structures remain useful. Others become increasingly difficult to justify as circumstances change. Royal commentators have often noted that one of the most difficult responsibilities facing future monarchs is deciding which traditions strengthen the institution and which traditions merely survive because nobody has challenged them. According to some analysts, the reports surrounding William's review seem to fit within that larger pattern. But if the future king was examining inherited structures, another question naturally follows. How would individuals connected to those structures interpret such scrutiny? Several royal watchers have argued that perception may matter as much as reality. Even if an internal review were entirely routine, people who felt their influence might eventually be reduced could perceive the process very differently. History shows that periods of transition often create uncertainty long before any actual change occurs. Sometimes the anticipation of reform generates more tension than reform itself. That observation helps connect another piece of the puzzle. Reports have suggested that what attracted William's attention was not necessarily the existence of relationships, but the concentration of relationships. One trusted advisor is unsurprising. 2 or 3 familiar names appearing repeatedly might still be explainable. Yet some commentators believe that repeated patterns allegedly appearing across multiple areas of activity may have encouraged the Prince of Wales to ask whether those patterns reflected deliberate strategy or simple institutional evolution. The answer remains unclear. What makes the situation compelling is that both explanations remain plausible. Supporters of continuity could argue that trusted networks naturally develop around senior figures who spend decades within public life. Others could argue that every concentration of influence eventually deserves examination, especially during periods of succession planning. The tension between those interpretations may explain why this story continues generating debate, and perhaps that is where Queen Camilla's position becomes particularly important. Some observers have suggested that Queen Camilla's entire public journey may help explain why loyal networks would matter so much. After years of public criticism and scrutiny, building relationships with trusted supporters could easily be viewed as a practical response to extraordinary circumstances. From that perspective, loyalty becomes a survival mechanism rather than a power strategy. Yet that explanation raises an even larger question. What happens when survival strategies developed during one era encounter the priorities of a future king focused on modernization? Royal commentators have frequently pointed out that Prince William's public image has increasingly emphasized accountability, efficiency, and institutional relevance. Whether entirely accurate or not, that perception shapes how every reported decision is interpreted. Actions that might have attracted little attention under different circumstances suddenly become symbolic because they appear connected to broader expectations about William's future reign. That symbolism may also explain why some analysts believe Princess Anne's reported involvement carries unusual significance. The Princess Royal occupies a unique position within the royal family because Anne bridges multiple eras of royal history. princess, and understands the monarchy before the digital age, before social media scrutiny, and before many of the pressures that define public life today. At the same time, and has consistently adapted to changing circumstances without abandoning a deeply institutional perspective. If reports suggesting conversations between William and contain any truth, some observers believe those discussions may have been important precisely because they connected experience with future planning. Not because, and would necessarily agree with every conclusion, but because and would understand the consequences of every possible choice. That connection introduces another layer to the story that often goes unnoticed. Many royal controversies appear personal on the surface, but become institutional when viewed more closely. A disagreement, involving individuals, may actually reflect competing ideas about governance. A debate about appointments may actually reveal concerns about legitimacy. Questions about influence may ultimately become questions about public trust. Could that be what is happening here? Several analysts have suggested that possibility should not be dismissed. The reports increasingly seem less concerned with individuals and more concerned with systems. Less concerned with personalities and more concerned with structures. Less concerned with isolated decisions and more concerned with the future direction of the monarchy itself. And that shift in focus may explain why the story continues expanding rather than narrowing. Because once questions about influence evolve into questions about institutional design, every discovery begins connecting to something larger. Decisions that once appeared administrative suddenly carry strategic implications. Relationships that once seemed personal become relevant to discussions about governance. Even timing acquires new significance. Why now? Why would such questions allegedly emerge during this particular stage of the monarchy's evolution rather than 5 years earlier or 5 years later? Some royal watchers believe the answer lies in the reality that succession planning is no longer an abstract concept. The monarchy is entering a period in which future leadership can no longer remain theoretical. Preparations that once happened quietly in the background may now be influencing conversations throughout the institution. And if that interpretation is correct, then perhaps the most important issue has not yet been fully understood. Because according to several commentators following these reports, the alleged discoveries may not have been the most consequential part of the story at all. What may matter more is how different figures inside the royal family reportedly responded once questions began being asked. If those reactions reveal what some observers suspect they reveal, then everything discussed so far may ultimately be remembered as merely the opening phase of a much larger transition that was already underway. If the reports are even partially accurate, then the story reaches a point where individual questions begin merging into a single, much larger issue. The alleged review, the recurring patterns, the reported conversations, and the growing attention from royal observers all seem to converge around one reality. The monarchy may be approaching a moment when future priorities can no longer remain quietly theoretical. At some point, preparation becomes visible. And according to some analysts, that visibility is exactly what started attracting attention. What appears to have changed most dramatically is not the existence of influence, but the perception of influence. Royal commentators have noted that institutions often operate smoothly when responsibilities are clearly understood and expectations remain stable. Difficulties tend to emerge when people begin anticipating a future that has not yet formally arrived. In that environment, even routine developments can acquire deeper significance because everyone starts interpreting them through the lens of what comes next. That may explain why reports of William's alleged inquiries generated reactions that extended beyond the immediate subject matter. Some observers believe that individuals connected to established structures may have viewed the process as a signal that future leadership intended to examine assumptions that had gone largely unquestioned for years. Others argue that such interpretations reveal more about public fascination with succession than about anything actually occurring behind palace walls. Yet regardless of which interpretation proves more accurate, the consequence remains the same. Questions that once existed privately had now entered a broader conversation. And once those questions entered public discussion, another pressure emerged. Expectations. The Prince of Wales occupies a unique position because every action is interpreted simultaneously through two different lenses. There is the role William performs today, and there is the role many people expect William to perform tomorrow. Reports suggest that this dual reality may have amplified interest in the alleged review. Actions that might appear administrative under one interpretation begin looking strategic under another. That distinction matters because expectations can become a force of their own. Some royal watchers have argued that public confidence in Catherine, Princess of Wales, and the future king has created assumptions about how the next reign might operate. Whether those assumptions are justified remains uncertain. However, the perception itself creates pressure. If people increasingly expect modernization, efficiency, and institutional focus, every reported development becomes evaluated against those expectations. And this is where several previously separate threads begin connecting together. The discussion about influence was never solely about influence. The discussion about appointments was never solely about appointments. The discussion about networks was never solely about networks. Each issue appears increasingly connected to a larger question concerning who will shape the monarchy's priorities during the next era. According to some analysts, that may explain why the reported involvement of Princess Anne attracted such attention. The Princess Royal represents institutional memory. William represents institutional future. If those two perspectives were indeed examining similar concerns, some commentators believe it would suggest that the conversation had moved beyond isolated administrative questions and toward broader considerations about governance itself. But governance creates consequences. Every institution eventually reaches moments when maintaining existing arrangements becomes a decision rather than a default position. Once a review begins asking whether structures remain aligned with future goals, neutrality becomes increasingly difficult. Continuing, as before, becomes one option among many rather than the automatic outcome. Could that be why reports suggest the atmosphere surrounding these questions gradually intensified? Several royal commentators believe it is possible, not because dramatic confrontations necessarily occurred, but because uncertainty itself can create pressure. People rarely react only to decisions. More often, people react to the possibility of decisions. When future changes remain undefined, speculation expands to fill the gap, questions multiply, assumptions spread. Every new development is interpreted as evidence supporting one theory or another. That dynamic may also explain why media attention reportedly became more focused on implications rather than events. Observers increasingly asked what these reports revealed about William's leadership style. Was the future king demonstrating caution? Was William demonstrating determination? Was the Prince of Wales simply conducting due diligence, or was a broader strategic shift already taking shape beneath the surface? No definitive answer emerged. Instead, each possible explanation seemed to generate another layer of uncertainty, and that uncertainty carried consequences for more than one individual. If the monarchy was genuinely entering a period of reassessment, then questions extended beyond Queen Camilla's circle. The implications potentially affected how future responsibilities would be allocated, how influence would be exercised, and how the institution might present itself to the public in the years ahead. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer about what had been discovered. The discussion was about what might happen because those discoveries had been made. That shift dramatically increased the stakes. Royal historians have often observed that the most consequential transitions rarely announce themselves immediately. Instead, they begin as a series of developments that seem unrelated until viewed together. A review here, a personnel question there, a changing public narrative, a growing emphasis on future leadership. Individually, each development may appear manageable. Together, they begin pointing toward a direction. Some observers now argue that this is exactly why the reports surrounding William's alleged review continue attracting interest. The individual claims remain debated. The specific details remain uncertain. Yet the broader pattern increasingly appears difficult to ignore. A future king reportedly examining inherited structures. An institution approaching generational transition. Questions about influence intersecting with questions about governance. Growing public attention focused on what the monarchy may become rather than what it has been. If those elements are genuinely connected, then perhaps the most important development has not yet occurred. Because according to several analysts, the significance of a story may ultimately depend not on what William allegedly found, but on what William decides to do with that understanding. Reports suggest that by this stage, the conversation had begun moving away from discovery and toward decision-making. And if that assessment is correct, then everything discussed so far may simply represent the build-up to the moment when future intentions become impossible to conceal. The reason that possibility matters is simple. Discovering a pattern can generate questions. Responding to a pattern can change an institution. And according to the most persistent interpretations of these reports, the next stage may reveal whether the future king was merely studying the monarchy he will inherit or quietly preparing to reshape it. And that may ultimately be the reason this story has continued attracting attention long after the original reports first surfaced. The deeper meaning was never necessarily found in the alleged review itself. The deeper meaning emerged from what the review appeared to represent. According to many royal commentators, the most significant aspect of the story is not what Prince William may have discovered, but what those discoveries potentially revealed about the direction of future leadership. Throughout the discussion, one theme has repeatedly surfaced. Transition. Not simply the constitutional transition that will eventually occur when one reign gives way to another, but the quieter transition that often begins years beforehand. Institutions prepare. Expectations evolve. Priorities gradually shift. Public attention moves toward the individuals who will shape the next chapter. Some observers believe the reports surrounding William's alleged actions have attracted interest because they seem to offer a glimpse into that process while it is still unfolding. If that interpretation is correct, then the story becomes less about influence and more about responsibility. The future king will eventually inherit not only titles and ceremonial duties but also systems, relationships, expectations, and institutional habits developed across decades. Royal commentators have frequently noted that one of the most difficult challenges facing any successor is deciding what should be preserved and what should be adapted. Preserve too much, and the institution risks appearing disconnected from a changing society. Change too much, and the institution risks losing the continuity that gives it stability. That balancing act may explain why analysts continue examining stories like this one so closely. Because beneath every discussion about advisors, networks, and internal structures lies a larger question. What kind of monarch will Prince William become? Some royal watchers have argued that the reports suggest a leadership style focused on examination rather than assumption. Others believe the story reflects growing public curiosity about succession rather than any meaningful institutional shift. Yet even those competing interpretations point toward the same conclusion. Attention is increasingly focused on the future rather than the present. And that reality carries consequences extending far beyond any single royal figure. The monarchy survives because each generation convinces the public that it remains relevant to the next. King Charles III faces the challenge of leading the institution today. Prince William faces the challenge of preparing it for tomorrow. Catherine, Princess of Wales, increasingly represents continuity, stability, and public confidence during a period when many people are already thinking about what comes next. Viewed through that lens, the alleged review begins to look very different. Rather than an isolated administrative story, it becomes part of a broader conversation about readiness. Readiness for leadership, readiness for change, readiness for the expectations that accompany succession. Some analysts have suggested that this may be why the story resonates with so many royal observers. People are not simply evaluating reported events. People are evaluating signals. Signals about priorities. Signals about governance. Signals about the future shape of the institution. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire discussion is that no definitive outcome has emerged. Despite the speculation, despite the commentary, and despite the competing interpretations, the central questions remain open. Reports indicate that observers continue debating what these developments actually signify. Some see evidence of modernization already taking shape. Others see routine preparation being interpreted through an overly dramatic lens. The absence of certainty is precisely what keeps the conversation alive. Because uncertainty creates reflection, and reflection often reveals more than conclusions. The story also highlights something important about how royal history is frequently understood. Significant moments rarely announce themselves as significant while they are happening. Only later, after consequences become visible, do observers recognize which developments mattered and which merely attracted temporary attention. Analysts have suggested that the current discussion may eventually be viewed in a similar way. Perhaps it will be remembered as a routine period of preparation. Perhaps it will be remembered as an early indication of a broader institutional evolution. At the moment, nobody can know with certainty. What can be observed, however, is that conversations surrounding Prince William increasingly center on leadership rather than inheritance. The public narrative is gradually shifting away from the question of whether William will become king, and toward the question of how William will govern when that moment arrives. That distinction may seem subtle, but it represents a profound change in perspective. And that may be the strongest insight to emerge from this entire story. The reports, the questions, the reactions, and the interpretations all appear connected to a larger reality. The monarchy is entering a period where future leadership is becoming increasingly relevant to present-day discussions. Every reported decision, every perceived priority, and every alleged review is being examined not merely for what it means today, but for what it might reveal about tomorrow. In the end, this may never have been solely a story about Queen Camilla's circle, institutional influence, or internal reviews. It may have been a story about preparation, about legacy, about how one generation hands responsibility to the next, and about how a future king begins defining leadership long before wearing the crown. The immediate questions may eventually receive answers. The reported concerns may ultimately prove significant, overstated, or something in between. What remains uncertain is how history will interpret this period once the next chapter of the monarchy fully unfolds. Will royal historians eventually view stories like this as routine moments within a stable institution, or will they see them as early signs of a larger transformation already taking shape beneath the surface of royal life? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.